master, Jeff Diaz, came up with the idea of having some dedicated speaker series online. And as the lodge education officer, usually I would do that in person at the lodge and talk about a Masonic topic or an educational topic. But we decided to pivot with things going on in the world today and have speakers. So our first speaker today will be Dad Peter Brusoe. He's an in-house speaker on the topic of DeMolay, but going forward, we're going to have very different topics, perhaps business speakers or different folks that might be of interest and to the general public, and as Masonic service to the general public. So something people listening in, if you scroll to the top of your screen, there's something called view options. It might have been set at side-by-side mode, but you can set it full screen so you can see the full presentation. During our presentation today, we'll be taking questions by chat. So right now, this is all in speaker mode. So Peter can take questions that he sees and answer them. But as the moderator, I'll also be, bringing them up. So Peter will go on for, 15, 20 minutes, and feel free to ask some questions. He'll introduce himself how he wants to, but, we're excited. Welcome to this Jacques DeMolay Lodge lecture series, and I will hand it over to Peter.
Great. Thank you, Brother Tom. Hopefully everyone can hear me nice and clearly. This is the nice part about doing this via Zoom. If I'm too soft, you can turn me up. If I'm too loud, you can turn me down. I really appreciate the invitation to be here and to go through things. Jeff, can we just advance to the next slide? So I really want to start off by saying thank you to Jacques DeMolay Lodge UD. This lodge, through your financial support of DeMolay, through your time talent that you give with being advisors, both here in the great state of New York as well as the good state of New Jersey, has been very exciting and very wonderful. Do want to spotlight, we do have with us the most worshipful William M. Sardone, the Grand Master of Masons of the Grand Lodge of the State of New York. No stranger to DeMolay, or George Washington and past State Master Counselors. Grand Master, thank you for being with us here today. We also have my bosses here tonight. Brother Austin Altman, the State Master Counselor of New York DeMolay. We are all about the youth and very happy to have him, along with several DeMolays from Knickerbocker chapter. My counterpart in New Jersey, Dad Paul Mossberg, and I saw Mom Gail Gould, the Supreme Inspector of Rainbow Girls, is also with us tonight. And just thank you all for coming here to talk about a little bit about DeMolay. So I want to go over some brief ground rules. And so Jeff, we can advance one. I basically do this for any of the talks I give. Ankara and Par is a very important part of whatever we do in Masonry. For those of you who are familiar with the phrase, it's from Galileo. It means I'm still learning. We're all still learning, be it the most senior Master Mason in a room to the youngest entered apprentice. There's always stuff we can learn, and sort of having an appreciation of what's more to learn, what can we learn from here is always a very helpful thing. I also view whenever we go into Masonic space, it's a safe space for us to ask questions, for ideas. The only silly question is the question that's not asked, so we're very looking forward to that. And also understanding we don't know everything. Every day I'm learning new things, particularly from our state officers who seem to keep schooling me in things I didn't know. And I like to say, if you're the smartest person in the room, though now the Zoom, you're probably in the wrong room. So tonight I hope to do 4 things. And Jeff, you want to go forward one? I want to talk about the radical empowerment of youth in DeMolay. We're going to talk about the DeMolay Congress, and we're going to talk about how do we empower the youth of today in New York, in our chapters, in our jurisdiction, and then have some open question Q&A, and we'll go from there. So let's go back 101 years. So the year is 1919. What is life like back in the Midwest? And, we've probably all seen the old, Nickelodeon cartoons and stuff like that of what life probably looked like. But I want to think a little bit about actually what life was like. So we want to go back to things that add context. So looking at the next slide, air travel is still ways off. We think about today, we think nothing of getting on a plane and flying to California, flying to Paris, or flying to London. Air travel is just the way we do things. But Lindbergh won't fly for another 8 years. We think about it tonight, we all have electricity. At that time, only 35% of the homes had electricity. 8 years later, it would only still be 68%. So majority of the homes in America did not have electricity. And you start to think about that. Laundry was done by hand. Phones were not a thing. The entertainment, you really didn't have entertainment. You could read a book, you could do some other things. There really wasn't a whole bunch of things you could do. Like right now, we're all at home. We can all watch Netflix. We can watch the Amazon Prime. We're playing video games. We can stay up late. Basically, the sun went down. You either went to bed or you started burning candles or burning oil. Not a really great solution. If you traveled at all, you did it by train, and trains were huge. And if you ever go out to Kansas City, you can actually see Union Station. You can see where all the train tracks came from all around the world, or at least all around the country to go right there in Kansas City. It was unusual to finish high school. Most people dropped out after 8th or ninth grade, not because they wanted to, but because of the financial stress their families were under, and that really finishing high school was a luxury. There were no social services. If there were social services provided by churches or fraternal organizations or synagogues, there really wasn't, right now, unemployment being what it is, people relying on unemployment insurance or relying on government-sponsored social services. None of that yet existed. For entertainment, the radio was really awesome. Radio was sort of like the new big thing, but was still very much in its infancy. The first commercial station comes online about 1918, and then if you have a radio, you're definitely very affluent. Otherwise, you might listen to a radio at a store, or people would gather around and listen to the radio. It's still very much in its infancy. What was huge was baseball. Everyone loved to play baseball. It was literally the national pastime in a way that it sort of just dominated the country. And we just ended our first World War. World War I marked for us a really big change in the American cultural zeitgeist, if you will. No longer were we so focused on being individuals and being the individual American. Now we saw ourselves more on the world stage. And America is changing dramatically. For the first time ever in 1920, more Americans lived in the city than lived in rural America. In 1910 it was about 39%. 1910 we hit 45.6. 1950 in 1920 it's finally 51.2. For some comparison, today 80% of Americans live in a metropolitan area. So, increasingly becoming more and more metropolitan. It also means the kids are off the farms. Kids are now living in cities. They might have jobs. They might have other things to do. But we finally have the invention of leisure, and we're getting into the 1920s. And this is also puts for us that young people are a bit of a loss. And we sort of need to think about what constitutes a young person. So we think about in 2020 in America, 18 is really like the legal age. 18 is the when you can be drafted in the military. 18 is when you can vote. 18 is when you can buy certain, it used to be is when you could buy tobacco in New York. But 18 sort of had this idea that, okay, that was kind of adulthood. Back then, it wasn't that way. It was 21. You couldn't vote until you were 21. You didn't really have a lot of good career prospects until you're 21. But they also have leisure. So leisure is now a thing. There's also these huge social concerns about the state of society. All this rapid change in America and all this technology is seen as perhaps being, corrupting. And there's actually a huge push against some of the modernization of society in the 1920s. We see the temperance movement wins big. All of a sudden, we're going to ban and prohibit. We have prohibition going on. So intoxicating substances are off the table. If those of you guys have seen the musical Music Man and talk about the trouble right here in River City, there really was, it's comical in the musical, but there was this concern that this is going to be the lost generation. This is going to be the lost generation of youth. They're going to have this leisure time. They're going to lack our traditional values. And like every other generation before, the olds kind of look down on the youngs with a sense of suspicion. And I think we see this microcosm best, the relationship between a young man and Louis Lauer and Frank Sherman Land. For those DeMolays in the room, you know that Louis Lauer was the first DeMolay, and Frank Land was the founder of DeMolay. But let's explore that relationship a little bit. So we go to the next slide. We mentioned there's a lack of social services. And one of the ways that fraternalism was huge is that fraternalism provided those kinds of social benefits, right? So you think about the Women of America, you have a lot of insurance benefits, the Knights of Columbus, the Odd Fellows, even Masonic organizations. The present-day Masonic care community rose out of a way of taking care of widows and orphans. And in the same tradition, the Valley of Kansas City had an unemployment bureau. You lost your job, there's no unemployment office, but you go to your local fraternal organization, they would hook you up. And so Frank Land ran the Social Services Bureau. Frank Land was a guy with a giant heart. He took care of widows, he took care of orphans. You didn't have fuel, he'll get you the fuel. You didn't have food, he'd take care of your food. He was the guy who, if you were a Scottish Rite Mason, you turned to. Well, Elmer Lauer, the father of Louis Lauer, he dies from complications from a hunting accident. And in this time, it becomes Louis' turn to support his family. And so he meets with Frank Land to see about getting a job and stuff. And Frank Land hooks him up. He works in janitorial services with the Scottish Rite Building down at Troost, downtown Kansas City. And they have a job. But what Franklin realizes, it's more than money this young man needs. He needs a guiding force. Who's going to guide him through the hard times? Who's going to be there that he can turn to and say, hey, I have this problem? Who's there to be the example? And at the same time this is happening, we also had the end of World War One. America, while we didn't have the huge losses that other countries had, we still lost over 100,000 men in World War One. And these were men who were caretakers. These were men who were father figures. And more than ever, you sort of have this idea of who is going to raise this generation of young men, who's going to give them the inspiration. And we actually have this example. We talk about single parent homes today. They really weren't a thing back then because you couldn't afford to be a single parent and live alone. So you had a lot of multi-generational homes. Frank Land himself grew up. He was raised by his mother and his grandmother, where they sort of pooled their resources together. But there wasn't really a strong male figure. And he recognized that there was need for that to provide that to services and to really be there. And so what happens is Dad Land and Lewis Lauer, they talk about the needs and they realize, you know what, let's form a club. And they wind up creating the Order of DeMolay because 9 young men wanted to play baseball. But it was more than baseball. So what did DeMolay offer them? Go to the next slide. DeMolay offered them fun, empowerment, elections. So if you think about it, most of them didn't have bank accounts. Now, by belonging to DeMolay, they had access to a bank account. They could write checks. They could spend their own money. They had fun. They had fun in a structured way that wasn't just hanging out in the streets playing pickup in the street. Pickup baseball, that is. They could also have their own elections. Here, they were electing their own leaders, where other organizations they belonged to at the time, be it the Sunday school or the school clubs, they didn't really have that option. It was all selected by the adults. And basically, the young men from all the same blocks, so it was Louis Lauer, his younger brother, everyone basically on the same street. They all went to the same high school. They came together. And originally started out because it was 9 young men who wanted to play baseball. But it grew because the young men are like, what else do we want to do? And one of them was like, hey, we want to have a marching unit. So they created a marching unit. Then they created a patrol. They had horses. They had bands. It was also something that wasn't school. It didn't matter if you weren't a good student. It didn't matter if you were no longer in school. Because again, most of them didn't finish high school. But you had the idea that you could still come and belong to this club and this organization. And in a lot of ways, America needed this program. This was the program that no one else had that helped to address the needs of young men in the 1920s who needed this kind of experience. And what happened is it grew like wildfire. It addressed a need. It went from Kansas City, went out to Nebraska, and basically burned through the prairies of the Midwest. It was amazing. And eventually it comes east and has a similar experience because all of this generation of young men need this kind of experience. And it is absolutely exciting to see this kind of empowerment that they did. I also think it's important to sort of have like a brief word on age. Jeff, you want to go forward one? We're not talking about a huge age gap here. When Louis Lauer and Frank Land met, Louis Lauer was 17, Frank Land was 29. It was just a 12-year difference, but those 12 years made a huge difference so that Louis had someone he could look up to and could give him and guide him in the right direction. In a lot of ways, Frank Land, who didn't have a son, appreciated the opportunity to sort of guide and direct the next generation. On slide 13, this is the baseball group, and this is how they went through and they had a good time. They played against some other high schools. None of them were good enough to be on the high school varsity team, but all of them were good enough to be competitive. And they had a good time playing. Their brothers had a good time cheering them on. This was who they were. And there's a great story about Dad Land. The Dad Land was their mentor, and for the next slide, he didn't talk much. We were all familiar with the Masonic Lodge room. Most of the excitement happens in the east. Everyone sits closer towards the east. They can hear the master council or the worshipful master. Dad Land sat way in the back. He sat in the southwest corner, and for most meetings, he just sat there and said nothing. He met before with the master council. He had the feedback to the master council. But there was one meeting, and it's so important that people still, the stories are told about it to this day, where there was a motion where they were having such a good time, they wanted to vote to limit the membership to only be 75 people. And Dad Land stands up, and he actually tells them, like, hey, guys, this is a really bad idea. He says, you're being selfish, and you should rethink it. He sits back down. Didn't scold him, didn't yell him, just says, hey, guys, this is what you should think about. And they listened to him, and they went through, and they changed the way they were doing this. And this was like the one time Dad Land really spoke in a meeting and sort of sets an example for the rest of us as advisors of how we really should let the youth be involved. So that's really, if you think about it, in 1920, this was radical empowerment of the youth. So we're going to skip a couple of decades ahead. As the world changed, so did DeMolay. DeMolay, while we felt the aftershocks of World War One, and we felt the aftershocks of the Depression, it didn't necessarily hurt our membership. Frankly, during the Great Depression, if it was not for Frank S. Land's personal character and the fact that people who had loaned DeMolay money knew him personally, we probably would have been kaput. But because of his strength of character, DeMolay kept going. The 1940s hits, and we go into World War II. It changes how we operate. We're no longer reattracting that 17 to 21 group, because they now have to go fight Nazism. They literally have to fight evil. And so what does Frank Land do? He actually lowers the age. So we go from the 17 crowd down to the 15 crowd. And all of a sudden, we're getting the younger brothers in. And it's exciting because now we're empowering an even younger generation of young men who perhaps need DeMolay even more, because not only are their fathers now in the household because they're all fighting the war, their older brothers are now in the household. And so all of a sudden, because they're also off in the war, you have an even younger group empowered to make their own decisions, to guide things. They never changed the philosophy. They kept the principles the same, kept the ideals the same, and went through there. And the world continued to change. And so, they go through and the world changes. If we go to, sorry, Jeff, I put in the slide here twice. In 1945 to 1960s, it's a real golden age for fraternalism. The war ends, everyone comes back, and every organization begins to thrive with the post-war boom. People are looking for brotherhood, they're looking for friendship, and we see masonry, every other fraternal organization in the world just dominate, where they have new members, bursting at the seams, and they're really enjoying the brotherhood. We also have prosperity and technology coming together. So where DeMolay stopped having state conventions and state conclaves during World War II, now they're coming together. The American automobile makes it easier for people to come together. And we see a return to having states having conventions and conclaves, and states have state master councilors again, because the older leaders have come back from the war. And so throughout the country, we're seeing these huge successful DeMolay jurisdictions, these huge, very successful state master councilors, and DeMolay International becomes more and more unified. Now, a brief word on governance. For those of you who are not familiar, Jeff, want to go one more slide forward? For those of you who don't know, DeMolay is governed by a Supreme Council. There are 150 active members. We call them gold collars because they literally wear a gold collar. Plus the executive officers who are also voting members, plus past Grand Masters. There's about 210 of the most dedicated, smartest, wisest, good-looking, for the most part, Masons in America who help to guide and direct DeMolay. We also have some deputy members who may someday become active, and we have honorary and emeritime members who don't have votes, but they have voice. And this is how DeMolay was governed for the first 50 years. These were the men who were making these decisions. But the question was asked, if you want to go forward one, if DeMolays can guide their chapters, their regions, their districts, and their divisions, why not on the national and international level? They had like this conference of state master counselors where some of the state master counselors would get together and say, hey, this is what we're doing, this is what we're doing. But it was kind of like a brief information exchange. It wasn't a very quality program, and it had no decision-making authority. A man named George Albert Newberry decided, let's lead the charge here. The young men are empowered on the local level, let's empower them on the national level. And he founded the DeMolay Congress. It was voted on by Supreme Council in 1966 and first held in 1967 at the Omni Shoreham Hotel over in Washington, D.C. And this is Dad Newberry. He was also sort of the right person at the right time. He was a very active Mason. He was from Buffalo, New York, the great state of New York. He was known as the Sovereign Grand Commander of the Northern Masonic Jurisdiction, which is the 15 northeastern states, and is arguably the most influential Masonic body in America, still is, where they helped to guide direction. He also gave them key funding. So not only, everyone has ideas, but ideas plus money means it's going to happen. And that's exactly what Dad Newberry did. His premise was simple. He believed if we want to make DeMolay relevant to the youth today, we must involve them. We must have a leader who speaks to them. It can no longer just be old men leading the young men. We need young men actually leading the young men on the international level. And as I mentioned, he was a past executive officer of Western New York, and he was Sovereign Grand Commander of the Northern Masonic Jurisdiction. So he also had the Masonic gravitas to make this happen, be able to convince people this was a good idea. And so 1967, DeMolay Congress happens. They elect Rick Coy from Michigan, the first international master counselor. And DeMolay Congress is incredibly successful because now no longer is it men just in their 60s and 50s making decisions for DeMolay. It's youth 17 to 21 making these decisions. And DeMolay Congress, it becomes a think tank. And so if you go to the next slide, some of the things that come out of there is they propose the Founders Membership Award, which, before you got 10 members and you got a Blue Honor Key. One of the things they realized is that not everyone was earning the Blue Honor Key, and a lot of them were, struggling to get in 5 in. If, young men who brought in 3, now all of a sudden they bring 5 in, let's recognize that. So they created, the Congress proposed the Founders Membership Award. They first proposed non-Masonic advisors in the 1970s. For us right now, we have women advisors, we have non-Masonic advisors, we have senior DeMolay advisors, we have advisors from every background. That wasn't a thing until the 1970s, and even the 1970s was very limited. We actually didn't have full-fledged female advisors until 2001. But the 1970s, Congress was pushing it, and only a few years later, DeMolay Congress actually, the Supreme Council actually accepted to the DeMolay's ideas. It promotes changes in how DeMolay functions. They all of a sudden stopped doing things that were cool 20 years ago and started doing things that were cool in the 1970s and 1980s. And it's funny, you look back at the old pictures of DeMolay Congress in the 70s and 80s, and fashion was not kind to anyone. But those were the thinkers, and that's how the DeMolay was changing and evolving to meet the needs of its time. They had robust committees whose ideas were shared with the Supreme Council. So if the Supreme Council has a ritual committee, Congress had a ritual committee. And this kind of, I almost felt like it was kind of like we have a bicameral legislature. We have the DeMolay Congress, and you have the Supreme Council. And the two of them would exchange ideas and work together. And it still happens today as well. The other thing that's really bold, if we go next slide on corporate power. So it's one thing to have youth leaders, and yes, those are our youth leaders, and that's great. DeMolay actually gives corporate power to the young men. We elect the two top leaders, co-equals, the International Master Council and the National Congress Secretary. And they are actually voting members of the board of directors. They have the same vote as the Grand Master and the Grand Secretary and our region reps. So in the same way that you have any corporate board, they are fully empowered members of the board, which is pretty bold. How many organizations do you know where they actually put youth on their board? I don't know of many. I know back home, our school board, we have the student body president as a non-voting member of the school board, but that's it. Here, they're actually corporate trustees and corporate directors. They also have votes in the Hall of Fame. They also carry with them the same fiduciary and other responsibilities. Having served on a few boards, it's unusual to have someone under the age of 30, much less under the age of 21, serving on a corporate board. But the way that DeMolay has structured it, these two members of the board of directors have the same fiduciary, they have the same training, they have the same corporate responsibility. And, I would tell you, actually I can't tell you, some of the decisions you have to make on the board of directors, you're fully involved with, in even confidential matters, which is really exciting. And kind of,
Hey, Peter, I have a question.
Yes, sure.
So how many members are on the board in total?
Good question. So you got the 2 Congress officers, you got the 3 progressive line, so that's 5, Grand Secretary, Grand Treasurer, 7, 8 region reps, so you got 15, 16. So it's 2 youth votes, I think 14 adult votes. The board of directors,
Thanks.
not to get too off topic, but in addition, so if you think about a good board has a variety of different representation on it. In addition to making sure we have youth representation, we also make sure we have regional representation. We don't want a board dominated by people from, Oklahoma. But so we have spread out the adult reps. So you have New England has representation. We have representation here in the Mid-Atlantic. The Southeast has representation. So it's another way they divide it up. And then, of course, so I will tell you, there's never been a vote where the youth have voted. There's never been a vote where it's been straight adults voting one way and youth voting the other way. There've even been cases where the 2 youth members have voted different ways. So it's really exciting. It's really is corporate power and real responsibility. I'm being sensitive to time here, but it's also an evolving Congress. So we want to go to the next one. Back in the days of 1967, DeMolay Congress met separately from the Supreme Council. In its heyday, not in its heyday, but like in the 70s and the 80s, DeMolay Congress would be like the first 2 days, and basically once their business was done, they would go home, and then the Supreme Council would come in. In the 90s and the 2000s, like, this is so, let's all meet together. And so what you wind up having is you'd have like shared meals together. You might have shared committee meetings, but when I was delegate in 2000, you actually had a wall up between the Supreme Council and the Congress. And so the two sides would be meeting, but they wouldn't be necessarily talking to one another. For those of you, it's kind of weird because I would walk in and, Dad Chisholm would be headed in his room, I'd be headed in my room, and that was it. We'd see each other at lunch. A gentleman named Rolf Frevel, who was, much like Dad Newberry, was a very prominent Masonic leader, who was the head of the shrine. He pushed forward to tearing the wall down. And he actually said, let's take the wall down. Let's have the two sides of DeMolay talk to one another. And that really changed things starting in the 2000s. So the Supreme Council and Congress actually, if you want to go to the next one, they should have a joint session.
I've got a question, Peter. What's
Sure.
an Imperial Line Officer?
Thank you. An Imperial Line Officer is a leader of the shrine. So Shriners International is governed by what they call the Imperial Divan. And so Ralph Frevel was going up the Imperial line. So he started out at the bottom of the line, would eventually become Imperial Potentate. So it's, I believe it's a 9-year progressive line, but it is one of the most influential positions in Masonry. Needless to say, Dad Frevel has had the Masonic credentials, if you will. But the wall comes down, and there's a joint session. And the first joint session, a DeMolay from Indiana stands up to speak. The Grand Master at the time says, well, according to our rules, we can't recognize you because you're not a Supreme Council member. And his executive office the next year introduced a resolution to change that. And so now when we go to Congress, the DeMolays have the same right to speak at Supreme Council as any other person does. And it's really incredibly empowering now to have that. I think one of our best sessions was when we were in Buffalo, New York. Not only because we were in the greatest state in the Union, but we had Grandmaster Sardone was presiding, and he worked very closely with his Congress officers to really make sure that it wasn't the session about the Grandmaster, it was the session about the young men. And Grandmaster Sardone, well, at that point, DeMolay Grandmaster Sardone did a really good job incorporating them and giving them free reign on various things, various programs. And it really felt like for the first time, Supreme Council and Congress had come together. What I would say is Congress continues to do great things. We have 2 great Congress officers this year. I always say we have great Congress officers, but this year I really mean it. Jared Rapogel from the great state of Arizona and Brother Tyler Moyer from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania have been doing some really exciting stuff for us as DeMolays. They've been going through, creating a lot of applications. Now that we've been dealing with COVID, they've organized international DeMolay game nights, international town halls, and doing things as well, like developing programs and projects. They've developed a DeMolay app, so now DeMolays can actually download the ritual on their phone, get access to other information. There's also an exciting program. They're working with the Scottish Rite Northern Masonic jurisdiction on a path forward. Many of you who are Masons may have seen the Not Just a Man, a Mason branding, and that's done wonders for Masonic membership. I keep hearing these awesome numbers from the Grand Lodge in New York about how much membership is increasing for them for interest. The Congress officers are working with the Scottish Rite to try to do the same thing for us in DeMolay. How can we replicate Not Just a Man, a Mason, to be not just a young man, a DeMolay, and make that going forward, which we should hopefully hear more about in our next session. So that's kind of what the DeMolay Congress is doing. We are excited. We do have 2 delegates each year, historically in New York. And if you think about it, so in New York, they elect the State Master Council to have a State Master Counselor. I'm blessed. I have 2. Actually, I have great state officers all over the place, but I have a very good State Master Counselor, very good Deputy State Master Counselor, who are our congressional delegates. So if you think about it, the young man in Knickerbocker chapter who votes for the SMC is then sending those delegates to vote in Congress. So it's kind of really, when we elect the IMC, it's the elected representatives electing more representatives, which is pretty exciting. And then, of course, on the international level, we are empowering the youth internationally. But how do we do it today? How do we do it here in New York? I think it's important to keep some statistics about the youth of today in mind. 20% of youth today, they only live with mom. That's where we're at with population statistics. 5% of the youth today live only with dad. 35% of families are unchurched. And this number is even higher for among younger groups. Americans are working longer hours. The 40-hour work week has been replaced with the 55 or 60-hour work week. Young people today are way overscheduled. So you have, soccer practice, then you have band practice. And so young men and young ladies have less and less free time. And in many ways, the DeMolays of today, however, just like Louis Lauer, they need that outlet. They need that sense of being able to do things and the sense of empowerment. And so here in New York, we've done a few different things to empower youth. Um, the key for us, remembering with DeMolay, is how we work with youth. Um, for too many organizations, too many instances, youth are told what they do, things are planned for them, and even down the structure of how things happen. As adults, each of us can plan a dance, we can plan a social. Most of us can plan a degree, though sometimes I wonder. Um, we can also plan a trip. The challenge for us as leaders is to be able to guide them to the right answer. I can say to Dad Jeff, worship brother Jeff, hey Jeff, can you plan this for me? 20 minutes can pound out a beautiful thing. Our challenge, though, is as adult leaders to try to get the young people the skills to build that up. And it often involves a lot of Socratic method and a lot of other things. One of my favorite quotes sort of guides the work I do with DeMolay comes from J.K. Rowling in Harry Potter. And it's like, youth can know how age thinks and feels, but old men are guilty if they forget what it was like to be young. I think one of my biggest struggles that I have as an adult volunteer is remembering what it was like to be young. It wasn't that long ago. It's now been 20 years. Thinking about how I felt as a youth and trying to remember the youth of today and making sure that we have the structures in place. One of the great things we have is we're New Yorkers. New York has always been on the cutting edge. If you want to go to the next one, to make DeMolay successful, we need to have culture. We need to have empowerment. We are very blessed to have a great Grand Lodge, and great Grand Lodge officer, great Grand Master empower us to be able to do what we need to do. We're also very lucky. We have two great partners with Rainbow and Triangle. Having worked with DeMolay in other jurisdictions, I can tell you it's really painful to do this job unless you have a good support from Rainbow and Triangle. Thank God we have that in New York. It also involves involving younger advisors. As I mentioned, there's only 12 years between Louis Lauer and Frank Lamb when DeMolay started. And that's an important age group. Our friends in New Jersey for a while there had very young chapter dads because the chapter dads were more connected to what it meant to be a young person, and they weren't that far removed. And it worked out really well when they were doing that. And Paul can correct me if they've maybe changed that, but that was a really good way of being able to do things. You don't know what you have until it's gone. I didn't realize how unique our New York culture was until I went to a DeMolay Congress. And we were sitting with delegates from another part of the country. We were talking, and we were exchanging notes about executive officers. And at that point, my executive officer was Dad Hazard. We're talking about, we did the state event. We played football in the snow. And the other guy's like, well, why did you guys do that? So what we want to do is like, your advisors didn't tell you what to do. I'm like, no. And though we were both DeMolays, these guys from the other part of the country had no idea that's why we did things in New York. And so we want to make sure we keep that unique culture. So I'm going to tell you a few things that we are doing, and there's more needs to be done to empower our youth. But here are just a few of the things. Convention planning. Last year, Dad Hazard asked the guys what they wanted to do for convention. The answer was Camp Turk. Dad Hazard was like, okay, let's do it. And there was kind of this reaction like, wait, seriously? And they were like, yeah, if the trustees are good with it, we can do it. And the change, like all of a sudden we're like, we could do something different was exciting for them. We have now adopted in New York, every single policy adopted by New York DeMolay State Advisory Council also needs to ratify the State Executive Committee. So it's, again, the two bodies. So the state advisors say, this is our policy. State Executive Committee can amend that or ratify that as they see fit. Simple things like asking what they want to have for meals. What do you want to have for dessert? And, it used to be, hey, this is the menu we got, this is what you went with. But now, one time they're like, hey, we want this for dessert, we don't want that for dessert. We make a quick change. Making a lot of youth-driven ideas. We're already in the middle of term planning for next year, and our Deputy Master Council has a lot of bold ideas. And most of it starts with, well, I want to do it this way. I'm like, okay, let's look into it. We've required chapter audits by members, in addition to giving them the fiduciary responsibility so they understand the finance, they understand how money works. Bylaws and processes on local levels, making sure the guys setting their own rules, their own things. And we're also mirroring DeMolay International's best practices on the Hall of Fame. Every area that we can empower the youth on, we're doing that. And we think that's been critical for the youth development. And also being comfortable with failure happening, that, sometimes we're going to try something, sometimes it won't work, but it's a learning experience. And the important thing is letting youth fail safely empowers them to succeed as well. Looking at the time, and I think I'm going to sort of cut off from there, but those are kind of how we've empowered youth throughout history in DeMolay, sort of what the DeMolay Congress is doing, sort of what we're doing in New York. And with that, I would take some questions if people have them. And I apologize for talking too long.
So if you want to use the raise hand function or just chat something in, we have a comment from Dad Mossberg that says, New Jersey, yes, there's still a mix of younger and older advisors, and not just at the chapter level, but also the state adult leadership team.
Yep. And I love New Jersey. They do some really exciting things, and New Jersey was, New Jersey has lots of good ideas. Their Winterfest model is something we've sort of emulated at different times. Their convention model is one. I kind of wish we had changed the borders of our state where it would take Wildwood into us. But no, I think New Jersey, I would say in Region 2, we know how to do things right. And we appreciate all the stuff New Jersey does. So Dad Jeff asks, sorry, what was your most memorable failure during your DeMolay career that you learned from? And how did you overcome from that? So I have lots of failures. I think the one that I learned the most from was we were doing a prospective member party in my chapter. I was master counselor, and we had arranged for sent out the invitations. We did all this. We were supposed to have 10 guys come. We had, at that time, Dad Ben Johnson was working for us out in Utica. He comes out, and we have one guy show up. At this point, I'm embarrassed. Dad Johnson came from all the way from Utica. We spent some money on this. I was embarrassed. I was like, I didn't want to come back to this chapter again. Like, oh my God, I let them down. And my advisor at the time pulled me aside, and Dad Clisby's like, come on, let's talk. He's like, look, here's where we sort of went wrong with this. And what it was is we didn't make the follow-up phone calls. Also, unbeknownst to us, we also scheduled it for the same time as the other high school's like big fall dance. And so what happened is a lot of the girls in the town over were dating guys from our town, so they wound up going to that dance. And so there were a lot of like points of failure that we learned from that we never had made the same mistake again. We made different mistakes. We never made that mistake again. And so I think that's when, gosh, that had been like 1997. But I still go back to that, and this is kind of why, and our state officers can tell you a little bit obsessive compulsive about, did we do X, did we do Y, did we do Z? And really going through making sure we have all those details together. I think the most important thing I learned in DeMolay was if it happens and you fail, dust it off, don't be judgmental, and go on and do the next thing. And I think that's also, I'm very lucky to have had great mentors in DeMolay that have shown me that, hey, it's okay if something bad happens, let's move on. And I think that's really, and not only has it informed my own experience in DeMolay, but also at work. At work we do a lot of lean, agile program development. And there have been times that I've had a work project disastrously blow up in my face. But because of that experience I had back in 1997, I can actually go through and do better from that. So I think that's one of those things that I've really learned from. And as an adult, it's kind of been interesting. I've learned a lot about how not to be how not to be an advisor at points, and I think one of those was I can't recreate the DeMolay experience I had. Each year at convention we do a rededication, and so last year we scheduled it like, okay, and we're gonna have music. The officer was like, really? I'm like, yeah, it would be great. And because I was thinking back to when I was a youth, and it turned out to be like the worst thing we ever did with convention. And it fell flat on its face because the youth had changed enough and we hadn't changed with them. And I joke with our state master counselor that, we really, we're going to have lots and lots of music this year, but we learned from that mistake and really learned to listen to the youth. And it's good to sort of keep those times in mind as well. If no one has any other questions for me, I know, Austin, are you still on the phone?
Let me see if I can unmute Austin. Austin, you're unmuted.
I am.
So, Austin, you've been to DeMolay Congress. What's been your experience?
DeMolay Congress is, I guess, interesting is the right way to phrase it. It's different from most state events that I've attended. It's incredible when you go. You see diverse ideas, you hear diverse thoughts, hear things that they're doing in NorCal, that they're doing in Colorado, that they're not doing, let's say, in New York. The things that you're doing in New York that they're not doing. But I think overall the best part of it is the voting and decision on the candidates. The fact that it's really put into the youth's hand, that it's us deciding what goes in the future of DeMolay, whether it's a new proposal for a bylaw change or voting someone into International Master Counselor. It's just an incredible process.
Thank you, Austin.
So we have a question from Brother Robin. What was the most important advice that you received from one of your advisors that you are still applying in your daily life? There's a lot of advice. I think the most important one is, and this came from Dad Roger Pelham, at the end of the day, you have to look at yourself in the mirror, and it doesn't matter what other people think. As you know, as long as you're proud of what you did, and as long as you did the right thing, hold your head up high. And if you're not, fix it. And I like that because it doesn't only apply to what I do in DeMolay and Masonry. It also applies to what I do in my professional life and my personal life. I will share with you, I had a conversation once with a past Grand Master, not of New York, who made a complaint to me. He's like, your problem is you're not my boy. I'm like, what do you mean? He says, I don't know if you're voting with me or against me. You always do what you think is right. I'm like, yeah. So then you should be good about that. Because it means I'm voting with you. It means just because I'm the right thing, you're doing the right thing. If I'm voting against you, you should reconsider it. He's like, I just wish you're more reliable of a voter. I'm like, well, you get what you got. There's also a question from Brother Lau about DeMolay Congress meets every year. It actually meets every year. This year it should be meeting, and we'd see what DeMolay International. There'd be a decision May 2nd, but it should be meeting this year in Arizona. Each year the Congress session moves around the Supreme Council. So this year we're supposed to be in Arizona. Next year we are in Texas. I think the year after that we're back in Kansas City. So it sort of goes throughout the country. And different jurisdictions hosted at different times. The meetings are open to, as long as you're registered for session, you can go and watch the meetings. And it's kind of interesting. Sometimes I feel like the Congress meetings are better run than the Supreme Council meetings, depending on who's Grand Master of the year. But it's always interesting. It's also fascinating to sort of hear how different things are in different parts of the country. You always have Washington State is like out there and being very progressive. And then you get states like, you get states that aren't as progressive. Then you get like the New York, the New Jersey people. And we just, we do our own thing, and that's where we're at. Do I get a vote since I'm a past International Master Counselor? I do not. DeMolay Congress is for the young men, of the young men. And so right now it's only 2 votes per jurisdiction. So New York with the same 2 votes as New Jersey, the same 2 votes as Massachusetts, and so on and so forth. But yeah, it's the old guys. It's the youth organization. MJ and Austin will tell you that like even with questions like who should you vote for, I'm like, I don't know. It's up to you guys. And that the adults do a really good job staying out of the youth politics. We have our own politics to worry about. How was your experience as International Master Counselor? Robin, it was fantastic. I had a great Congress Secretary, Brother John Haney from the great state of Illinois. We did a lot of, I may have rubbed some feathers the wrong way because I was a little bit too New York for their tastes. And remember, I'm an upstater, so I'm kind of a laid-back New Yorker. But we did a lot of exciting things where we did like an international membership program based around Lord of the Rings, which was at that point was very popular at the time. We also did, we did a lot of focus on encouraging people to get their Blue Honor keys, getting their Founding Membership Board. I actually took a bus from Ohio all the way down to Tennessee, flew out to Idaho, went out to Missouri, went out to Kansas, went down to New Jersey, went up to New Hampshire. And it was amazing to see just the brotherhood throughout the country. Literally, you walked into a place in Topeka, Kansas. They didn't know you, but you were welcome because you were a DeMolay. You knelt at the same altar. And it really gave you a very bold view of the way that DeMolay really is about brotherhood. I also learned a lot about nonprofit law. I'm serious about the corporate governance. There's a lot of things you learn on the board of directors. And there's lots of decisions that, at times like, gee, why did DeMolay International do it this way? There really was eye-opening of, oh, this is why we do it this way. I also learned a lot about insurance and youth protection I ever wanted to in my life, which has actually helped me a lot as an adult volunteer and sort of how we approach things. How does the campaign process work for running for International Master Counselor and/or International Congress Secretary? Yeah, so it's changed a little bit. When I ran, you couldn't talk to anyone about your running officially. And again, this is 17 years ago. So like there was this new thing called like instant messenger. So you could kind of do some of that. But really, you couldn't really do like launch a national campaign and stuff like that. But you did a lot of phone calls. I was lucky; I attended a lot of leadership conferences, so I had friends and allies throughout the country. So I had friends in New Hampshire, I had friends in Massachusetts, I had a strong support out of Georgia, and some good support out of Ohio, and so like really set myself up pretty well nationally. I will tell you, and this is such a classic Jersey thing. The young man I was running against. So what happens? There's also sort of campaign trips. Yeah, to win Congress office, you had to either go to California or New Jersey. And like New Jersey was like the kingmaker. If you didn't go to New Jersey, you weren't getting elected international officer. And also because they have a lot of good IMCs. So New Jersey, they put the guys running for office rooming together. So this is like the most tense weekend of my life. Because here I am, I'm running against my competition. We both know we're running, and neither one of us like really talking about the election. And afterwards, I said to the guy, I'm like, "Hey, how come we said it was just guys?" Oh yeah, we and he's just like, "Oh, we got a huge laugh out of it." But what my approach was simple. This is what I think. If you like me, vote for me. If you don't like me, well, I'm not the guy for you. And I think I went back to the advice that Deb Palm gave. I did nothing that would not be. I did nothing except what I thought would be honorable. And I tell you, as they were counting the votes, I had written down a piece of paper. So what you're supposed to do is, and if you lose, you're supposed to concede the election and give up your votes. As I had written down, so in case I lost, I could say it. Luckily, I didn't have to say it. But no, it was a good campaign. It was about issues about ideas. Does that answer that question? What inspired you to join DeMolay? Was it the personal development fun or to make friends? Okay, so this is a good and hopefully that answers the campaign question. So I joined DeMolay because my grandfather was a Mason. Back in the day, we had 8th grade graduation parties, and so we invited my friend Patrick to come to the party, and his mother was involved with an organization called Amaranth, and she was talking to my mom. My mom's like, "Oh, Peter, the Mrs. Philberta was talking about this DeMolay program that I think you really like. That's sponsored by the Masons." And my mom's like, "I don't know who the Masons are, but your grandfather was one, and your grandfather was the best man I knew, and if the Masons were good enough for him, this should be good enough for you." Like, okay, so when do they meet? She says Friday nights. So what do I say? No. And this, 9th grade passes. 10th grade, my friend Patrick comes back to me and says, "Hey, we moved our meeting nights to Thursday nights." I'm like, oh, I can do Thursday nights. And so December 27th, 1996, I go out to Utica, New York. I take my initiatory and DeMolay degrees. It's one of those, let's get guys in before the close of the year so we make growth. And I joined because I thought it was going to be fun, interesting, and it was everything and more. I'm glad I said yes. And my one regret is I kind of wish I had said yes when we were meeting on Fridays. So it would give me an extra year in DeMolay. But I really value the time I had.
We had a comment from the Grand Master earlier. Our plan was to have him ask him how he thought things were going in the last 10 minutes, but he had to drop off. But he said, "Thank you to Dad Brusoe. Great to see advisors caring about Masonry and our youth. Great combination." And he wanted to thank all those who are contributing to Masonry and DeMolay during these stressful times. Especially nice to see DeMolay's on the call as well. They had a bunch of other lodges to get to. So he's proud of us, and thank you to all. And to the boys, he says, "Be good."
Thanks so much, guys.
Take care, guys.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you again, Peter.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Night.